Larry Cuban, professor at Stanford University, said that school reform is, quote, changes that have been incorporated in the routine operations of schools in 1988. In the first half of the 20th century, economic, social, and political forces all impacted school reform. For starters, economics played a huge role when it was the beginning of the fact that the federal government started to get involved in schools. They announced funding and they had more say in legislation and schools' curriculums. For example, in 1917, the Smith Hughes Act was created that, quote, provided federal aid to the states for the purpose of promoting pre collegiate vocational education. And that's from Steffi's 2020. Socially, more and more children started attending school. After the Industrial Revolution, families started being able to send their children to school rather than having them stay home and work like they had been doing decades prior. With the increase of vocational education due to this funding and government institution, and industrial programs, quote, in high schools were offered by reformers during this period in large part to entice the working class and poor to stay in school and prepare them adequately for what reformers thought was their appropriate role in society. And that's according to the Library of Congress. Politically, in terms of social politics, schools used to be run by businessmen in the towns and locals who served on the what we now call as the school board, who were in charge of financials, the curriculum, etc. It wasn't until later on in the 20th century where superintendents began assuming power and responsibilities that we now know of, and that's from Mina 2017, page 137. Like I've said, economic, political, and social forces have all played a role in school reform and the way schools operate. When thinking about federal government and its involvement and increased role in education, there are both some positives and negatives. With more government involvement meant higher government funding for schools. And with more funding, that led to better opportunities for children, better working conditions for teachers, and overall just better environments for students and everyone. And it was this funding was necessary and resulted in more positive opportunities for students, like I stated. On the other hand, federal involvement also meant that the government had say in the curriculum and legislation that schools had to follow, which led to states ultimately losing control of education, which ultimately could have caused a lot of problems. As a result of federal government's involvement was the No Child Left Behind Act. This legislation was created in 2001 and aimed to, quote, establish minimum performance standards for students, schools, and school districts, and to provide assistance and impose sanctions on schools and districts that do not meet the performance goals as a condition of receiving federal aid. And that's from Gortz 2005. Despite these positive aspirations, there has been a lot of drawback and criticism that came with the NCLB, such as placing too much emphasis on standardized testing, unfunded federal mandates, and feeling of too much federal government involvement. And that's from Yebin 2023. Overall, economic, social, and political forces continue to carry on in today's education systems. For starters, schools still heavily rely on funding. However, data suggests that states such as Mississippi, Nevada, Arizona, and Idaho, to name a few, are ranked in the top 20 least educated states, according to World Population Review 2024. And they also, as well, are listed in the states that have the lowest funding per student, according to Hansen 2024. This data just proves that if schools and students are invested in, education and opportunity gets better. Political forces impact school reform for a few reasons, some of which are directly related to the economics that I just stated. For starters, if speaking politically in terms of red versus blue states, the top five least educated states are West Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Alabama, and that's according to World Population Review 2024. All of these states do tend to lean red, But a big reason for that is that those states also happen to be in the deep south, rural areas where poverty and underfunding happens a lot, and the resources are not available to those states, or at least not used in the correct way to give the necessary funding to these schools, versus urban affluent cities that have the higher education rates, such as New York, Massachusetts, California, Hawaii, etc. Lastly, social forces are what create school reform, in my opinion. Because of social forces and the evolution of our education systems, educators like Larry Cuban and others push for changes in curriculum, educational opportunities, and just overall better learning environments, all of which makes students' education's journeys better and hopefully will provide more opportunities to grow.